think I'm joined up here by some amazing folks. I want them to introduce themselves, but we're going to talk really around digital infrastructure, where it's evolving, satellites, and data centers. There is one caveat. Craig, we only have 40 minutes, so your intro needs to be less than 40, okay? But let me pass over to Guy, and he can start off.
All right, Guy Wilner, professional mic sharer. I've been in the data center industry since 1998, and was involved in IX Europe, which was sold to Equinix, and then Terraco in South Africa in the early days, where we launched NAP Africa, and then Russia for my sins, which is another story, and more recently IX Africa in Kenya. I'm advising Helios investment partners on digital infra across Africa, and I'm doing a little bit of work with APTA across Europe, and then I'm on the board of Elia Digital with Goldman in Brazil, doing data centers, so around the place.
So Craig Scroggie, CEO of NextDC, we're Australia's leading data center as a service provider. We've been going for over a decade with 13 operational data centers in Australia, with another 6 under construction. We're building our first sites in Malaysia and New Zealand, and getting very close to then starting Japan and Thailand and a few other places after that.
Everybody, Jeff Tench. I'm the responsible for our North America and APAC businesses at Vantage Data Centers. We have a business that spans 5 continents, been on a rapid expansion over the last several years, operating in across the APAC theater, EMEA, and North America. And focused on selling a service to a small number of very large customers in the hyperscale space.
Hi, I'm Mark Dankberg. I'm not a data center person. I'm a satellite networks guy. So what we do is we provide connectivity to people that are otherwise unconnected. Probably the main way a lot of y'all might be familiar with us is for in-flight communications, especially in the U.S. market, where we serve I think 5 of the top six airlines. We've recently expanded by acquiring Inmarsat, so now we go global. Our markets, besides in-flight connectivity, are defense users, VIP aircraft for the United States and other countries around the world, government, national security applications, which have some unique data center requirements. We also provide the network security for applications that go into those classified data centers. And then also we'll do residential fixed enterprise as well. Think of it as a lot of applications, especially for people who are in flight and using mostly video, just like on the ground. Those are big drivers of data center connectivity.
Yep, Joe Zhu, founder, CEO, ZenLayer. What we do is 2 things, edge compute close to the users and the interconnectivity between data centers.
Great, hopefully, okay, this is working now. I'm gonna start off with Jeff, and as we talked about before, when we did an initial call, how do you, when you're moving into a new market, how do you figure out how you're gonna lay the groundwork and sort of establish that new market? And then we'll take comments from the rest of the folks as well.
Yeah, and I think this is true less for our North American business, where we're operating in the US and Canada. Those are pretty well known, pretty well understood. In EMEA and in APAC, as we consider entering into a new market, obviously we're looking very closely at the sort of geopolitical elements that are going on. A lot of action in the world right now, not all of it great. So that is a big consideration as we see opportunity, particularly in emerging markets. But at the same time because of the breadth that we have geographically, we try to strike a balance between those aspects of our business which are globally consistent in the way in which we have a basis of design, the way in which we approach operating our data centers in a standard way, because it's the same customers that we're trying to serve. And then that's really important in order to drive scale. That said, this business is incredibly local. It's that data center on that piece of land with that local jurisdiction in that country with that energy policy. And so there's an enormous amount of effort required to establish a local team. In many cases, in certain markets, we will work with local partners who are on the ground, have been on the ground, in some respects as a U.S.-owned or U.S.-based company operating in these different theaters. In many places where we go, we are strangers in a strange land. And so we recognize that, and we work with local partners in a lot of cases for connectivity to ensure that we have the right procedures with regard to permitting, entitlements, working with power utilities, et cetera. So it's sort of both the scale globally really helps, but at the end of the day, it's very, very local.
Craig, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I'll just build on Jeff's comments because I think that's a good place to start. I'd add that we're an enterprise channel first data center builder. So population's probably the key driver, Tony. The size of a metro, density of the population, the number of enterprises and government clients. Those are the users ultimately that need to move out of legacy on-premise, not sustainable data centers that don't have the power, that don't have the connectivity, the choice of cloud on-ramps and other things they need to be successful. The second consideration then becomes the cloud CSPs themselves, so they then want to serve those customers. There's another consideration, so we do hyperscale metro regions and we also do edges, and the key driver for edges when you're in a location in Asia, getting submarine cable from country to country is critically important so that there's no single point of failure. 2 routes legitimizes a service for a country. So I think all of those aspects, building on Jeff's comments, is that it's led by the size of a metro and an enterprise.
And Guy, you've moved into a lot of unique areas. It'd be good to hear sort of in the emerging markets kind of what you've been doing, because there are some challenges. I think Jeff mentioned geopolitical. Obviously, you've probably encountered those in the past.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the African continent, you've got 54 countries. By 2050, so that's 25 years, there'll be a quarter of the world's population, and probably a lot more than that in terms of people under 21 as a percentage. And yet today there's only 1% of the world's data center capacity on the continent. So you can see the mismatch. But you're dealing with a different country every time, a different legal system, different regulatory system. So then when you start looking at that, it quickly reduces down to South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, and then maybe another 10 countries beyond that. But it's still early stage. You hear all the noise about what's going on in Southeast Asia, and Middle East, and Europe, and US, and Africa's still pretty quiet. There's a couple of zeros off on the capacity at the moment. But it's that noise level is beginning to grow.
And Mark, I know not the same in terms of data centers and satellites, but on our call, you were talking about how you're moving into new territories. Probably there's some of the same challenges, but I'd be interested to hear about kind of what the satellites are experiencing as well.
Yeah, so the thing that we're seeing is it used to be if you're going to provide service to a country, they might be a little bit concerned about where that data lands, like where an antenna would be. Now, there's a lot more concern about the data itself. And one of the things that we're doing is moving, there's 2 different vectors going on in the satellite space. One is to do a lot of processing in space, route things in space, which is kind of expensive, has some advantages for, say, secure communications, but it's not a good thing for a country that's concerned about its national infrastructure. So the thing that we're doing is moving all that data processing into data centers, which can be local to each country. So think of it as virtual control, and now you're getting into kind of the same data sovereignty issues that you'd normally deal with social media or other applications. So what we think is that's going to be a trend also. The other thing that's going on, and we're one of the main people pushing this, is the ability to go directly from a satellite to any cell phone or watch or any mobile device that's connected to terrestrial. But from a country's perspective, the downside there is, again, bypassing national infrastructure. So as an example, the biggest example there is Apple working with Globalstar and their iPhones, iPhone 14 and above, that have this SOS capability. So as an example, India immediately banned the sale of those phones there because they had a bad experience with people using terrorists using satellite phones. So what we see, I think there's a big opportunity, and it goes to this issue about getting more data center capacity in all these countries, is more and more going to assert their rights not only to their terrestrial infrastructure, but to the space above them and to the data that originates and is destined in there. We also already deal with those issues for in-flight, you can imagine. So for instance, we serve China, which is going to have its own infrastructure. Chinese airlines may want to use that, but international airlines going to China may want to use other infrastructure and other data centers along the way. So I think those are the big trends, is extending that notion of data sovereignty and infrastructure into space.
Joe?
Yeah, I think obviously we operate a global fabric, right? So in the past, it's very flat, very easy to operate. Now, so many countries has different requirements. So it's definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because we also provide compute service. Lots of companies do that. Basically, you process data locally, also extract the non-sensitive data and communicate each other, right? I think it's a challenge, it's an opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there's been, when we were doing our call before, there's a lot of, and what we're seeing within the space, power has become a real challenge. And not only power, the lack of, the rates. Why don't we kick off, and we'll start with Craig, and then just move around. But Craig, if you can talk about, I think everybody's having the same challenge, but how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, I think if you go back in the last decade, a big data center in the US might have been 40 or 50 megawatts, and a big data center in Australia was 10. In the local power infrastructure was capable of absorbing that within reason, and it was old industries. It was the change and the shift in the industrial revolution as we moved from large-scale manufacturing in those countries. A lot of that was outsourced to lower-cost countries, and that power was then consumed by data centers as we drove more digital age and connectivity. And we're now an order of magnitude larger, so a standard-sized data center in the US can be 100, 200 or 300 megawatts, and in Australia, 10 has become 100 or more. There was no foresight from a scale perspective as to that need, nor was the transmission infrastructure in place. So the generation of power is one issue to solve. The transmission of power is another. And then if you layer on today's significant focus on ESG, getting renewable energy and having solar and wind, and the challenge of then having battery systems to store it, or if you can do geothermal or hydro, you have alternatives, but that infrastructure doesn't exist on scale, anywhere near the scale that is needed to get it behind the meter. So having it, and having it in a useful place, or having the transmission infrastructure, they're all very significant challenges and ones that will need to be solved over the next decade.
Okay, I think it'd be good to talk a little bit about Africa, because there's obviously power challenges, and it'd be super helpful.
Just a quick one. I mean, people say, "Oh, Africa, power's difficult in Africa, isn't it?" And that's like saying power's difficult on planet Earth. Some countries are different from others. So 3 examples. In Nigeria, it's been mostly oil, and you're generating your own power on site. If you're lucky, you're on the grid, and it's moving to gas, so you'll be generating with gas. But there's no line of sight to green energy of any substantial amount in Nigeria at the moment. In South Africa, you're burning dirty coal, and you've got load shedding. That will change in the next 4 or 5 years. And in Kenya, at the moment, you've got 92% green energy, because they've got geothermal from the Rift Valley, you've got wind, you've got solar, you've got hydro. So that East Africa side is quite interesting. You could end up with a gigawatt of compute in that area, because it's basically green energy, and it's not green energy buying some solar from 2,000 miles away and some carbon credits. It's actually real green energy. But Africa being Africa, it's in a massive development phase. So you come back in 5 years, and maybe Nigeria will be green energy and South Africa will be green energy as well. But it's early stage.
Joe, do you want to jump in on the power question?
Yeah, sure. Power nowadays is a real resource. Right? Everyone is trying to grab a power. I think the GPU deployment is also interesting. Maybe will distribute the power system a little bit, because now the GPU deployment, it doesn't matter where you are, as long as the power is, right? People will just grab it. Yeah. maybe fusion power will come to play soon, so hopefully.
Mark, any issues that you're experiencing in satellite space?
No, the main thing we're seeing indirectly is more data center operators moving to places, sort of unconventional places where there's not infrastructure, being interested in satellite as a way to get the ability to provide connections, even if it's only on a transient basis, to those places where you can get the power but can't get the connectivity.
Jeff, I know you've been building like mad, so it'd be good to hear.
I would add to Craig's comments that we're seeing generation as well as a challenge. And the reason is, the public utilities and the sort of standard, regulated or semi-deregulated monopolies have been doing capacity planning for 100 years on the back of, low single-digit growth. And particularly over the last several years, that's been punctuated by these very, very concentrated deployments of data centers, whether they be in places like Northern Virginia or in Frankfurt or other pockets. Singapore is a great example as well, where they've had to put very strong moratoriums in place because they simply don't have the infrastructure. I think that the responsibility that we have as operators is to participate in partnership with those folks and with the utilities, but recognize that for a lot of places where our customers, at least for me, for our customers where they need to go, we're going to have to find ways to make our own. And we're doing that in a number of places around the world right now. We're building our own power plants in island mode that are not connected to the grid at all. So we're not contributing to their congestion problem. From a public policy perspective, there's growing voices that are saying, look, we're building all this extra power for these data center operators, but the consumer ratepayer is picking it up in the tariff. There is a dynamic associated with that we as operators don't control. That's related to their rate of return environments that they often are in. So we're trying to look at all of the above and with a bent towards renewable, but that is a even further challenge. Right now, the reality is that we need the power. If we can make it renewable, we're going to work on that over time. The condition of the current grid in many places has such a high carbon coefficient that if I can build a natural gas turbine plant, which is burning a fossil fuel, it can still be 40% better than the mix of oil and coal or wood or whatever else biomass that these guys are burning to generate power today. So it's a step. It allows us to continue to grow, but over time, we're going to need further options.
Both you and Craig mentioned renewables. It'd be good to talk about that. I think, just on a personal view, I think it's there, but I don't think it's there for data centers yet from a renewable perspective. Good just to hear some context on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'd say at the moment it's a power grab, and you've seen how much capacity is being gobbled up in Germany recently, and Germany's burning, opening coal plants at the moment, so it's gone into reverse in terms of climate change. But then over time, we've seen TikTok in Green Mountain in Norway, we've seen people like Elia Digital in Brazil signing a lot of customers who have really focused on green energy because Brazil's got tons of green energy. So I think what we may end up seeing in 5-10 years' time is large geographic zones around the world, maybe 6 or 7 of them, where there's a massive concentration of real serious green energy because there's just oodles of hydro or geothermal or something like that. And that will add to the mix and change the mix of data centers a little bit. It won't change anything about localized data centers addressing populations. That's still a big market.
Yeah, look, we operate in certain markets. Quebec province is a good one in Canada where it's 100% hydro. Right. So, and we have significant power constraints, particularly on transmission in that part of the world. So the alternatives that you have there, given where it is, the climate, it means solar is not a great option, wind is not a great option. And if I go in there and say I'll build a natural gas plant, the answer is no, you're not, because the entire province is being run on hydro at the moment. So it is situational. It depends on what the best alternative is. Land prices as well, data center as an industry and other, chip factories, distribution, land prices are increasing and making the economics work for a large-scale solar plant in a close enough proximity to the where the data centers really need to be from a latency perspective make that challenging. But in the U.S. has some recent legislation that's driving a lot of incentive for decarbonization of the grid. It's attracting investors. That's really helpful. I think that across the world, those energy policies are more nascent, but as they mature, the hope is that we can get the right sort of incentives so that we can cooperate with those types of investors. We ourselves are not a power investor, but we sort of have to be in the absence of an alternative.
Look, I would add that there's no question that solar and wind are critically important to the future energy mix, but they are intermittent. The sun doesn't shine all day, the wind doesn't blow all the time.
It does in a tapper bar.
Yeah, it does. The need for us to consider, carbon-free baseload energy replacements for coal is critically important. I mean, ultimately, the technology exists today in nuclear to be able to build small modular reactors or micro-reactors. The argument that we haven't seen them commercialised or commoditised is the key hurdle that we need to get over in order to demonstrate that they can be built successfully and at the right unit cost. Safety is the other big concern that we see. And the reactors that were designed and built in the 70s are very, very different to the ones that are capable of being built today. The argument that submarines have been getting around for quite some time safely is evidence that we are capable of building micro-reactors and that they are safe. And getting power behind the meter that is carbon-free in all of the locations, particularly in bigger cities and other areas where they just won't get the generating capacity and be able to then have the transmission infrastructure in place that's required. There are answers to these problems. They will, in some cases, require a significant amount of education for local communities to understand that the technology is safe and viable. They'll need to be proved out economically for investors, that there can be a reasonable return on capital on those infrastructure investments. And that in some countries, and in particular Australia, we have legislation that prohibits the development of nuclear power stations, and those things will need to change. So there's a lot of effort that will need to go in, but I believe that we have the solutions available to us. We just have to be prepared to do the work to get them across the line.
So there's obviously a lot of, thank you, Craig, pressure for all of you to produce and grow. But I wanted to start with Joe and talk about, what technology advances are going to help you and spur continued growth for you from a go forward?
Yeah, I guess everyone heard this word, AI, right? So, yeah, for us, the new growth engine is the inference. So right now, the GPU centers for training, we are betting on next 12 months, inference is become a critical infrastructure because the users will interact with the inference server first, then they will go to getting the information from the large models. So for us, we've been testing it, we've been beta testing and deploy the service. So this is definitely a growth engine because the use cases like gaming, right, the streaming, and all the basically virtual assistants, those type of use case. Yeah.
And Mark, a little bit different context, but kind of where is that growth coming from for you? I know you mentioned you're now in 5 different markets, but are there any advances that take you more to 10, 15, whatever it might be?
Well, for us, in terms of transmission, it's really video. Video on the commercial side, especially in flight, it's a great time for people to sit back and burn down their binge list. But same thing's now happening on Maritime, whether it's for passengers or crew. So that's driving a lot of data growth as well. And then there's also, because of AI, a lot more, and because of the decarbonization issues, a lot more emphasis on real-time navigation, route planning for flights and for maritime users. Again, just because they're very big consumers of fossil fuels, basically, transportation networks are. So the things that we can do there, a lot of that is based on multiple, what real-time weather analysis as opposed to hours-old weather analysis would be an example. For defense users, imagery is a huge thing. Earth observation, imagery, AI for object detection, change detection, and then the other big thing, so I think of that as the inbound, and then on the outbound, it's distributing the results of that to people all over the world as well. Those are the things that are really driving growth. And then on the national security side, that's driving demand for secure data centers because that data is super sensitive.
Jeff, do you want to jump in on kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to ignore AI, but if I think about our target customer base and for them, the driver is their, let's start with their overall sort of commercial cloud offerings. I mean, those businesses are huge already. They're growing at a, let's call it a 25% top line clip. So that means that every 3 years or so, each of these providers has to double the amount of capacity. That is to say, they have to deploy as much data center capacity as they have ever deployed in their history every 3 years, and then you add AI on top of that, which is a massive vector of demand as well. I think, and I'll challenge you a little bit on the location doesn't matter thing for GPUs, because it does, depending upon the use case, right? So for a lot of my customers that are going to market, they're integrating AI as a feature, right, into an existing set of cloud offerings in a B2B context. Others that have significant scale, that have maybe perhaps more of a B2C model, it may end up being sort of a different sort of approach. But at the end of the day, they can't be, in most cases, other than perhaps large language training centers, which are massive and can be more isolated. It's adding, they're not quite, the proximity requirements aren't quite as tight, but they need to be in the general vicinity, which is good for us in terms of being able to establish scale in a given market. But yeah, this is not a demand side problem, and there's more than can be satisfied just about anywhere I look.
I would add two observations, one related to markets and one related to technology. On the market side, the world is no longer flat. We're seeing more geopolitical instability than we've ever witnessed, certainly in recent years. Depending on US election outcomes and other things that will become even more controversial over time. But we're seeing more wars fought than at any other time in history recently. That means that the deglobalization of infrastructure will be heavily driven by countries' desire to want to ensure that information has been repatriated, that data sovereignty and privacy and other things. So in the past, we're all focused on globalizing and getting to the lowest unit cost in the lowest cost location. And now there will be a very significant focus on protecting information and infrastructure in a sovereign way in every country in which we all operate. So that's a huge change from where we've been over the course of the last decade. So that's my observation on the market side. On the technology side, what is it that's driving change? And it's GPU. GPU as a product relative to CPU means that the volume of power required per square metre changes, and that GPU density drives a change in power and cooling. And cooling technology ultimately will be the most significant change, and it will be transitory insofar as, in the most immediate sense, direct-to-chip cooling can be retrofitted to many data centres today that have the capacity to do that with water. Direct-to-chip rear door heat exchangers, and in the future we may see more immersion very early. Mining industry has been doing immersion successfully for years. The technology is there. The question is, will we be able to move to that in some reasonable period of time? There's no question that the unit economics will certainly be very, very favourable. But the key driver ultimately is density, and that means that the changes for power and cooling designs will see very significant design changes in the data centres over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in a state of disruption here, because we had a pretty quiet, in technological terms in the data center industry, we had a pretty quiet time between 1999 and 2020, where we went from maybe 3 kilowatts a rack to maybe 8 kilowatts a rack average or something, and suddenly it's all been blown away. And it's not going to be immediate. A lot of customers are still asking for 12 kilowatts, 20 kilowatts or whatever, but they're saying, yeah, but it's probably going to be 70 in a few years, and there are small instances of that. But that's a radical redesign of the data center that takes you to much bigger campuses because you've got to be able to deal with all of this cooling stuff. But touching on what Craig said as well, and on the geopolitical side, we're entering an interesting phase in technology because we're not going to have technology all being developed in the same place. We're going to have all sorts of different technologies being developed, and that's quite exciting, that's quite creative. So the world is going to go through this weird stage, maybe 20 years, where there actually be much more technological creativity than there was, because you have different people thinking of different things.
Jeff, we touched on it briefly, but it'd be great if you can talk about, is sustainability as important as it was, or is it just speed to market because of the necessity to kind of go live quickly?
And I think that everything we do, we try to do as sustainably as we can with the options that we have that we can sort of justify economically. I think that I agree, by the way, with Craig's comment about nuclear. It has to play a role, and I'm not just talking about data centers. I'm talking about in general. There's going to be a long-term energy problem, and nuclear is one of the only credible ways that you can really get to the scale that's required, whether it's in small modular reactors or in more industrial deployments. But I think there's a battle between speed and the need for ourselves, our customers, their customers, with the pressure they have to continue to grow revenue, but to try to do it sustainably. There isn't enough renewable energy available. So for most folks that are in tech-intensive, that means power-intensive industries, they've made promises. We've made promises. Everybody's made promises about where we're going to get to. And the way in which the vast majority of folks are going to get there is through a combination of being efficient, investing along the way in renewable projects directly, but ultimately writing a check for renewable energy credits, carbon offsets, et cetera, depending upon what commitments that they've made. Are there going to be enough of those available for everybody to do that in 2030 or 2040, whenever they've made that commitment? So I think in the short term, there's a lot of pressure for speed. I'm not saying that sustainability has been deprioritized, but it's a matter of what's available. So there's a lot of investment to come in this space, and particularly in creating, well, I'll call it data center scale, renewable in proximity to where these data centers need to be, and there is not enough today.
Craig, do you want anything?
I would just build on Jeff's comments to say, if we think about the size and scale of power requirements, obviously, wind, solar, geothermal, depending on what country you're in, and if you're fortunate enough to have the ability to take advantage of those things, that's a no-brainer. Getting them behind the meter is highly advantageous, but it's generally difficult to do. So therefore, you need to invest in the transmission infrastructure to do that. From a sustainability perspective, the low carbon outcome is the one that everybody is going to need to continue to search for. And that does mean that we're going to have to build zero carbon technologies, but it's not only on the power side. When you think about supply chains, a good example is we won't have enough battery metals available to build the batteries when everyone moves to EV, which largely we will do over time. Electric vehicles will become the standard. And as that happens, all of the battery metals that are required to be able to build the batteries to run a global scale EV fleet will mean that the battery availability for building large scale batteries will be a challenge. We'll run into new resource challenges. So those issues are ones that will need to be considered. The last point is everything in the supply chain has some carbon footprint, and big issues like carbon in concrete, from a manufacturing point of view, they're going to have to change. So carbon-free concrete technologies and other things will all have some impact in fully recycling all the materials that we use in development. So.
I just want to see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes?
You're talking about small scale or small modular nuclear reactors. There's a company called NuScale.
Yep. Yeah, sure. NuScale example is a good one. It's certainly got a lot of publicity. NuScale haven't gone bankrupt, but the project itself was shelved. There are other projects under development. I think the key issue with nuclear, I'll break it down into three parts really quickly. First of all, most people, the argument economically is that projects are always a decade or more in length, they're always over budget, and therefore the numbers will never stack up. That's the number one argument when people talk about nuclear. Until you commoditise, commercialise and build this technology over and over again in a factory, you can't get to the right unit economics. When you build one of anything, show me a company that builds one of something where the economics make sense. So the first issue we have to overcome with nuclear technology is it needs to be commoditised and commercialised and built in a factory, and the unit economics will look after themselves. The second issue is that these are being invested in today. People like Bill Gates, Sam Altman have very, very significant multi-billion-dollar cheques written to developers of nuclear technology. You've also got people like Microsoft having just recently hired a head of nuclear energy development. We are making progress in these areas, but it is very early days, and it's people like that who have been successful that can put billions of dollars behind these projects. The third element in nuclear relates to the education and safety issues. There is a brilliant series by a guy called Eric Townsend, and he has a podcast called Macro Voices. He made a 7-part series just recently on nuclear technology and all of the safety and economic considerations. Watch it, it's on YouTube, not on Netflix, but it is absolutely worth watching and getting some education, because understanding that the nuclear reactors that were built in the 70s, and even examples like Fukushima, those disasters don't and won't happen today because the technology, whether it's molten salt or thorium reactors, we have the ability to be able to build and operate very safe nuclear technology. There's also an argument that says large-scale economics can still work, but we have successfully, companies like Rolls-Royce successfully manufacture micro and small-scale nuclear reactors today for military applications. All your aircraft carriers floating around the ocean are run with nuclear reactors. It can be done, the evidence is there, it just needs to be commercialised. Hopefully that gives some context.
Just want to see if there's any other questions. Yep.
Yeah, yes. Thank you all for supporting PTC, but a question for Mark. How do you see your kind of the GEO versus the LEO and in the context of Starlink, and how do you see your business evolving? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So the simplest answer there is, if you're in the connectivity business, one of the first things you want to do is understand the geography of demand. Where is the demand in the world? And it turns out like 95% of the people on the earth live on 5% of the land. Even things like global aviation and maritime is very, very heavily concentrated because basically all the transportation networks tend to go from city to city. They spend some time in between. So the big issue, so think of it as, think of satellites as just towers in space. The payloads do the work, and so the big question is, where do your towers go? And the problem is, the only place in the world, the only place around the Earth where you can remain constant with respect to the surface of the Earth is at geostationary. So what the problem with, as you go to orbits that are not geostationary, is you now have no control over where your towers are, and 90+% of them are in places that there's no demand or very, very little demand. So the good thing about low Earth orbit is that the latency is lower. The bad thing is that the efficiency or productivity of your space network tends to be low. And once you get to a place where you actually have to justify a return on capital, then that's what drives the geosynchronous market. And then the other big thing, and this is sort of where the industry is going, is hybrids, because 85 to 95% of the traffic in the world is not latency sensitive because it's driven by video. That's the dominant source of video. So what you're seeing now are an evolution to hybrid networks where the bulk of the non-latency sensitive traffic likely will be served very efficiently from geosynchronous orbits. The latency sensitive traffic would be served by higher value, low Earth orbits. I think that's where the market's going.
That actually ends our session. So thank you. Thank all of you. It was great. Enjoy the rest of PTC and appreciate everybody's time here.
Thank you.